year was 1944. The air over Athens smelled of smoke, not from cigarettes or fireplaces, but from the ruins of a country tearing itself apart. And no one knew it yet, but this small, war-torn nation would soon become the first real battlefield of the Cold War. Before Berlin, before Korea, before Vietnam. The Greek Civil War wasn't just a fight over power. It was a fight over the soul of an entire continent, between two ideologies that couldn't exist side by side, communism and capitalism. And the world was watching. Today, we're diving deep into one of the most misunderstood wars of the 20th century. The Greek Civil War, a conflict that not only ripped Greece apart, but also set the stage for the decades-long Cold War. You're going to see how a country that fought courageously against Nazi occupation ended up fighting itself. How friends became enemies, how villages turned into battlegrounds, and how the fate of Greece was decided not just by Greeks, but by the world's emerging superpowers, the United States, the Soviet Union, and Britain. By the end of this story, you'll understand why Greece became the testing ground for a new kind of warfare, one not just fought with bullets, but with ideologies, propaganda, and fear. The seeds of division. It all started long before the gunfire of the 1940s. To understand the Greek Civil War, you have to go back decades before, to a Greece still struggling to find itself after the fall of the Ottoman Empire. Greece had been through one crisis after another: the Balkan Wars, World War I, the disastrous Greco-Turkish War, and a devastating refugee crisis. By the 1930s, the country was exhausted. Political chaos, economic hardship, and corruption had turned democracy into a fragile dream. Then came Ioannis Metaxas, a man who promised order and delivered dictatorship. In 1936, he took power, banned political parties, and ruled Greece with an iron fist. His regime mirrored the authoritarian governments rising elsewhere in Europe, with censorship, secret police, and even a fascist-style youth movement. Still, for many Greeks, the greater danger was yet to come, because just a few years later, the world would be plunged into World War II, and Greece would once again be caught in the middle: the Nazi occupation. In October 1940, Italy invaded Greece from Albania. Mussolini's forces expected an easy victory, but the Greeks fought back fiercely, pushing the Italians deep into Albanian territory. It was a moment of national pride. The world cheered. Even Hitler took notice. But pride turned to tragedy when Germany intervened. In April 1941, German troops swept through Greece with overwhelming force. Within weeks, Athens fell, and the swastika was raised over the Acropolis. The occupation that followed was brutal. Greece was divided into zones. The Germans took the main cities, the Italians controlled much of the countryside, and the Bulgarians took Macedonia and Thrace. Famine struck. Entire villages were burned. Tens of thousands were executed or died from starvation. And in the chaos, a new resistance was born. The resistance begins. Across the mountains and villages of Greece, small groups began to fight back. The largest of them was EAM, the National Liberation Front, and its military wing, Hellas, led by the Communist Party of Greece, KKE. At first, they were heroes, liberating villages, ambushing German convoys, and bringing hope to a starving nation. But they weren't the only ones. There were other resistance groups too, smaller, non-communist ones like EDES and ECA, made up of monarchists, republicans, and officers loyal to the old government in exile in Cairo. For a while, these groups fought side by side against a common enemy, but underneath the surface, they had completely different visions for what Greece should be after the war. EAM wanted a people's democracy, a socialist Greece aligned with the left. The others wanted to restore the old order. The monarchy, the traditional elite, the Western alliances. The Germans were the enemy on paper. But the real fight, the one that would define Greece's future, was already taking shape in the shadows. The British return. When the Nazis began to retreat in 1944, British forces moved quickly to fill the power vacuum. To Churchill, Greece was not just another small country. It was strategically vital. Britain needed it to stay out of Soviet influence, especially with the Red Army advancing across Eastern Europe. In October 1944, as German troops withdrew, British soldiers landed in Athens to help restore order. But order was the last thing they found. Hellas controlled most of the countryside and demanded a share of power in the new government. The British-backed Prime Minister, George Papandreou, wanted them to disarm first. Negotiations failed. Mistrust grew. And then, on December 3rd, 1944, Athens exploded. The December uprising, Decembriana. Thousands of unarmed EAM supporters marched through the city to protest. British troops and Greek police opened fire on the crowd. By the end of the day, dozens were dead, and Athens was in chaos. This was no longer a political dispute. It was open warfare. For weeks, Athens became a battlefield between British forces and Hellas fighters. Buildings burned, civilians hid in basements, and brothers turned against brothers. In the end, the British crushed the uprising. Hellas was forced to retreat. But the damage was done. Trust was gone, and the dream of national unity had shattered. The Greek Civil War had officially begun. The smoke over Athens had barely cleared from the December uprising when a chilling silence settled over the city. The Germans were gone, but peace never came. Instead, Greece had traded one occupation for another, not from foreign soldiers this time, but from fear, suspicion, and revenge. People whispered again, not about the Nazis, but about their neighbors. Who had fought with EAM? Who had collaborated? Who was a communist? Who wasn't? It didn't matter whether it was true. In post-war Greece, a whisper could get you killed. A country without trust. The British victory in Athens left behind a fragile government, one propped up by bayonets and foreign aid. To the left, it looked like betrayal. They had fought and died to free Greece from fascists, only to see power handed to the old elite. To the right, it looked like salvation. Britain had saved Greece from Bolshevik chaos. But for the people on the ground, farmers, workers, refugees, it meant hunger, prison, or worse. tens of thousands of suspected leftists were rounded up. Villages known for supporting the resistance were burned again. This time, not by Germans, but by their own army. Men were sent to Macronisos, a desolate island prison where re-education meant torture until you signed a confession renouncing communism. And yet, despite the brutality, the idea of resistance refused to die. The road to civil war. In March 1946, Greece held national elections, but the left boycotted them, claiming persecution. Unsurprisingly, the royalists won, and soon after, the monarchy was restored. The communists, now outlawed, went underground. Their fighters, many of whom had been heroes in the war, fled to the mountains, especially in the rugged north near the Yugoslav and Albanian borders. There, they regrouped under a new name, DSE, the Democratic Army of Greece. At first, their goal was simple: survival. But slowly, whispers turned to plans, and plans turned to war. By summer 1946, armed clashes had erupted in Macedonia and Thessaly. Ambushes, assassinations, and skirmishes became daily news. It wasn't an official war yet, but everyone knew what was coming. The world is watching. Now, remember, this wasn't just a Greek problem anymore. By 1946, the world had changed. Europe lay in ruins. Germany was split. The alliance that had defeated Hitler was crumbling fast. In the east, Stalin's shadow stretched from the Baltic to the Balkans. In the west, Churchill warned of an iron curtain descending across Europe. And right there, on that fragile line between east and west, was Greece. To the British, Greece was the last bastion before Soviet influence swallowed the Mediterranean. To the Soviets, Greece was a test, a chance to see how far the West would go to protect its sphere. The Cold War hadn't officially begun yet, but Greece was about to light the first spark: the Truman Doctrine. By early 1947, Britain was exhausted. The empire was crumbling, its finances drained. They could no longer afford to support Greece. So they handed the problem to a rising power, the United States. On March 12, 1947, U.S. President Harry S. Truman stood before Congress and made a speech that would change world politics forever. He said, "It must be the policy of the United States to support free peoples who are resisting attempted subjugation by armed minorities or by outside pressures." That sentence, calm, simple, but explosive, became known as the Truman Doctrine. It wasn't just about Greece or Turkey. It was about drawing a line. From that day forward, the United States would fight to contain communism anywhere it tried to spread. And the first test case would be right here in Greece. The American arrival. American aid poured in: money, weapons, advisors. The Greek National Army was rebuilt, retrained, and rearmed under U.S. supervision. The CIA's predecessor, the OSS, began organizing intelligence networks to hunt down guerrilla leaders. To many Greeks, it felt like an occupation all over again, but with different accents. To others, It felt like salvation from chaos. Meanwhile, the DSE was also getting help, not directly from Moscow, but from Greece's communist neighbors, Yugoslavia, Albania, and Bulgaria. They provided weapons, food, and safe havens for the guerrillas crossing the borders. The lines were now clear. The battlefield was set. And soon, the war would turn into a full-scale inferno. Life in the mountains. Imagine this. It's 1947. You're a young farmer in Epirus. Your family has lost everything. Your father was killed during the occupation. Your brother is in prison, and your village was burned. The DSE comes through, offering you a rifle and a purpose. They say, fight for freedom, fight for equality, fight for Greece. What would you do? For many poor Greeks, especially in the countryside, joining the guerrillas wasn't about ideology. It was about survival, justice, and revenge. The DSE promised land reform, dignity, and a future where peasants wouldn't starve, while the rich drank imported wine in Athens. Their ranks swelled with farmers, women, and even teenagers, often with no formal training but fierce determination. They knew the terrain better than anyone. They could vanish into the forests, strike suddenly, and disappear before dawn. For a time, they had the upper hand, the shadow of Tito. But there was another twist, one that would change everything. The DSE's main supporter was Yugoslavia, under Joseph Broz Tito, who had his own brand of communism, fiercely independent from Stalin's control. Tito's Yugoslavia was the lifeline for the Greek communists, providing bases, supplies, and medical aid. But Stalin wasn't happy. See, Stalin had made a quiet deal with Churchill. Back in 1944, the infamous percentages agreement. On a napkin, they divided Eastern Europe into spheres of influence. Romania and Bulgaria to the Soviets, Greece to the British. So when the Greek communists begged for Soviet help, Stalin said no. He told them to stand down, but Tito ignored him. That tension between Tito and Stalin would eventually explode, cutting off the DSE from its strongest ally and sealing its fate. But we're getting ahead of ourselves. For now, Greece was burning again, and the world had just entered a new kind of war. One, the mountain air of northern Greece crackled with gunfire. By late 1947, the Greek Civil War was no longer a series of scattered uprisings. It was a nationwide conflict, a brutal and relentless struggle between two visions of Greece's future. On one side, the Greek National Army, GNA, backed by Britain and now the United States, trained, equipped, and funded to the teeth. On the other hand, the Democratic Army of Greece, DSE, a guerrilla force fighting from the mountains, was fueled by ideology, desperation, and the memory of occupation. This wasn't just a war of bullets. It was a war of beliefs, of stories, of who owned the truth about what Greece was meant to be. The American machine. When the Americans stepped in, everything changed. New uniforms, new weapons, new strategies, and a new sense of purpose. American advisors flooded into Athens under the American military mission, bringing modern warfare tactics, and more importantly, the Marshall Plan money that would reshape not just Greece, but all of Europe. planes roared over the rugged Greek mountains, dropping supplies to loyalist forces, and sometimes more of the villages. The heart of the battle wasn't Athens or Thessaloniki. It was the villages. Tiny settlements perched on mountain ridges became prize targets, captured and recaptured again and again. The DSE thrived in these rural areas. They built liberated zones, small pockets of control where they set up local governments, schools, and even hospitals. They taught villagers to read, redistributed land, and held elections that felt like hope. But the government saw these zones as nests of rebellion. So they launched Operation Torch, Operation Dawn, and countless other offensives to clear them out. Entire villages were evacuated. People were forced to move into government-controlled areas, a tactic called villagization. It was meant to cut off the DSE from food and shelter, but it also tore apart centuries of rural life. Imagine being told you had to abandon your home, your olive trees, your ancestors' graves, and move to a fenced-off, secure camp miles away. That was life for hundreds of thousands of Greeks in 1948, the women of the war. And then there were the women. For the first time in modern Greek history, women fought in large numbers, especially on the communist side. They weren't just nurses or cooks. They were commanders, snipers, and couriers, carrying weapons through snowy passes and defending mountain outposts. To many, they symbolized liberation. To others, they were traitors, women who abandoned their roles. Propaganda posters showed DSE women with rifles, framed by slogans about equality and revolution. The other side painted them as brainwashed or immoral, tools of foreign ideology. But beyond the politics, these women were simply human. Daughters, sisters, wives, forced into choices no one should ever face. Their courage and tragedy remains some of the most haunting stories of the entire war. The mountain strongholds. The DSE's stronghold was in Gramos and Vitsi, two mountainous regions near the Albanian border. Rugged, remote, and hard to reach, they became the beating heart of the communist resistance. There, the guerrillas built bunkers, dugouts, and hidden camps. They lived off the land, supplied through narrow passes from Albania and Yugoslavia. The government called them bandits. The DSE called themselves freedom fighters. In reality, both sides were trapped in a war neither could afford to lose, and both knew it. The turning tide. By 1948, the tide was beginning to turn. The Greek National Army, now heavily reinforced and guided by American advisors, launched a massive offensive called Operation Koronis, the largest military operation in Greece since World War II. Artillery thundered across the mountains. Hundreds of planes bombed DSE positions relentlessly. Napalm, a terrifying new weapon, was used for the first time in Europe. The guerrillas fought fiercely, but the odds were impossible. They had no real air cover, no heavy artillery, and their supply lines were stretched thin. Even worse, the political winds were shifting. Tito breaks with Stalin. Remember Tito, the Yugoslav leader, who had been helping the Greek communists. In 1948, he broke with Stalin in what became known as the Tito-Stalin split. Suddenly, Yugoslavia was isolated from the rest of the communist world, and Stalin ordered all communist movements to choose sides. The Greek communists, loyal to Moscow, had no choice but to abandon their Yugoslav supply routes. The border that once brought them food, ammunition, and medicine now slammed shut. It was a disaster. Cut off from their lifeline, the DSE began to collapse. Hunger spread through the mountain camps. Deserters fled, and hope began to fade. Desperation and division. Inside the DSE leadership, tensions grew. Some commanders wanted to fight on. Others wanted to negotiate. Their leader, Markos Vafiadis, a respected veteran, clashed with the party's hardline direction from Moscow. Eventually, he was removed, exiled to the Soviet Union. Control passed to more rigid ideologues, who ordered one final stand. But on the ground, morale was breaking. Thousands of guerrillas had been killed or captured. Entire units vanished into the forests, never to return. Still, they refused to surrender. Children of the war. In one of the war's most controversial acts, families were ripped apart. Some children wouldn't see their parents again for decades. Propaganda from both sides turned this tragedy into a weapon. The left claimed they saved lives. The right said they stole them. No matter who you believed, the truth was clear. Greece was losing its future generation to a war with no mercy. The Cold War tightens its grip. By 1948, Greece was no longer just a small conflict. It was a global symbol, a test case of whether the West could stop communism from spreading into Europe. American newspapers called it the battle for Europe's soul. US military officials called it the cornerstone of containment. And in Washington, a new agency, the CIA, founded in 1947, began seeing Greece as its proving ground. Covert operations, psychological warfare, and political manipulation, all tools that would later define Cold War strategy, were being tested here, in real time. Greece had become the blueprint for the next 40 years of superpower conflict. The summer of 1949 was blistering hot in the Greek mountains. But the heat came not from the sun. It came from artillery fire, from explosions that tore the mountains apart, and from the final struggle of a war that had devoured an entire nation. This was it. The last stand of the Democratic Army of Greece, the DSE, against the full might of the Greek National Army, backed by the United States. The battlefield, two names that still echo in Greek memory: Gramos and Vitsi, a nation on the edge. By mid-1949, Greece was exhausted. Villages were empty. Fields lay barren. Families were divided, not just by ideology, but by fear. The government in Athens, led by Prime Minister Alexandros Diomedes and guided by US advisors, promised one thing: this war ends now. For 3 long years, Greece had been ground zero of the Cold War. Billions in American aid had poured in. Modern weapons, training, logistics, all now focused on one goal: to crush the DSE completely. The DSE, meanwhile, was running on fumes. Cut off from Yugoslavia after Tito's break with Stalin, their supplies came only from Albania, and even that was limited. They were hungry, wounded, and outnumbered, but they were not ready to surrender. The last redoubts, Gramos and Vitsi, the final DSE strongholds, were in the rugged mountains along the northern border, Mount Gramos in Epirus and Mount Vitsi near Florina. These weren't just hills. They were fortresses, natural walls of rock, forest, and mist. For years, the DSE had turned them into hidden fortifications with tunnels, bunkers, and supply caches carved into the stone. To capture these mountains would mean breaking the spine of the rebellion. To lose them would mean the end of the dream of a people's democracy. And so, in the summer of 1949, both sides prepared for one final, decisive confrontation. The U.S. air support. This wasn't just a Greek operation anymore. It was an American coordinated offensive. Advisors from the U.S. Army supervised every major move. Pilots trained in U.S. flight schools bombed DSE positions day and night. And for the first time in Europe, the U.S. authorized the use of napalm, the sticky, burning firebomb that clings to everything it touches. The mountains burned, the forests turned to ash. Even from miles away, people could see the sky glowing red over Gramos at night. Operation Pyrsos, Firebrand, on August 10th, 1949. The Greek National Army launched Operation Pyrsos, meaning torch or firebrand. It was a massive, coordinated assault involving 180,000 soldiers, hundreds of artillery pieces, and relentless air bombardment. The DSE had barely 10,000 fighters left, many of them wounded, starving, or barely trained. But they fought like cornered lions. For weeks, they held the mountain ridges, repelling wave after wave of attacks. They knew there would be no reinforcements, the retreat. Under the cover of darkness, battered columns of DSE fighters began their retreat northward. Carrying their wounded on makeshift stretchers, they crossed into Albania, where they expected to regroup. But the Albanian border guards, acting on Soviet advice, disarmed them. Their weapons were confiscated. Their leaders were exiled. The war was over. For the fighters who made it out, exile meant decades in Eastern Europe, scattered across camps in Hungary, Romania, and Czechoslovakia, dreaming of a Greece they might never see again. For those who stayed behind, it meant imprisonment, torture, or execution. And for Greece, it meant peace, but not healing. The cost. The Greek Civil War left over 150,000 dead. Hundreds of thousands more were displaced. Entire villages vanished. The economy was in ruins. The countryside depopulated, and the nation divided for generations. Families wouldn't speak to each other. Children were taught that their uncles or cousins were traitors. The wounds of this war would take decades to even begin to close. The shadow of victory. On paper, the government had won. The communist rebellion was crushed. Greece was secure, and the Western alliance had held firm. But the victory came at a cost that went beyond lives lost. It left Greece under the shadow of foreign powers, first Britain, then America. Aid, reconstruction, and politics were all tied to loyalty to the West. In 1952, Greece joined NATO, cementing its place in the Western Bloc. But at home, the fear of communism became an obsession. Thousands of people, writers, teachers, artists, were monitored, censored, or blacklisted for even hinting at leftist sympathies. Democracy survived, but it was fragile, watched, restricted, and haunted by the ghosts of the Civil War. The Cold War's first test. For the United States, the Greek Civil War was a success story, the first victory of the Truman Doctrine. It proved that American intervention could contain communism. It set the model for the next 4 decades, from Korea to Vietnam, from Latin America to Afghanistan. But it also revealed the dark truth behind that policy, that freedom often came with strings attached, and that saving a country could sometimes mean breaking it first. Greece was both a warning and a lesson, a reminder that in the Cold War, no nation was too small to become a battleground, and no war ever truly aftermath. The lost generation. In the years that followed, the exiled fighters of the DSE lived in a strange limbo. Some settled in Eastern Bloc countries, teaching, raising families, waiting for a chance to return home. Some never did. Back in Greece, the survivors faced persecution and silence. For decades, even mentioning the words "civil war" was taboo. Official history called it the Bandit War. It wasn't until the 1980s that Greece officially recognized the conflict as a civil war. And only then did families begin to speak openly about what happened. By that time, most of those who had fought were old. Their memories faded, but the pain never did. A country still divided. Even today, the Greek Civil War leaves traces in songs, in stories, in the quiet bitterness between old neighbors. It wasn't just a war of guns. It was a war of memories, of who was right and who was wrong. And maybe that's the cruelest thing about civil wars. They don't really end when the shooting stops. They keep living on inside people's hearts. The final reflection. The Greek Civil War was small in scale compared to the world wars, but its impact was enormous. It set the pattern for the Cold War. Local conflicts fueled by global powers, ideology over empathy, and propaganda over truth. It showed how quickly liberation can turn into division, and how ordinary people, farmers, teachers, children, can be swept into forces far bigger than themselves. In the end, the Greek Civil War wasn't just about Greece. It all began here, in a land where democracy was born and nearly died. A wounded nation. When the last gunfire faded in 1949, Greece was left in ruins. Villages burned, bridges gone, roads torn apart. 500,000 people displaced, wandering between camps, ruins, and exile. It wasn't just a war of weapons. It was a war that had torn apart the soul of a nation. The victors returned to towns that no longer existed. The vanquished were ghosts, exiled, imprisoned, erased from memory. The Greek Civil War was over, but the scars it left behind would last for generations. Reconstruction under the shadow. In the early 1950s, Athens began to rebuild. The Marshall Plan brought aid, factories, and roads, but also dependency. Every dollar came with a message: stay loyal to the West. The Greek government, eager to prove its reliability, cracked down on any sign of leftist thought. Tens of thousands were blacklisted from public jobs. Books were banned. Songs censored. In schools, children were taught to fear communism, not to question it. Freedom had returned, but it came wrapped in chains, exile, and silence. For those who fought on the losing side, silence became survival. Some lived in remote mountain villages, pretending to have never been involved. Others lived in exile in Hungary, Czechoslovakia, and the Soviet Union, dreaming of olive groves they might never see again. They wrote letters that never reached home. They listened to Greek music on shortwave radios. They aged in foreign lands, their stories forgotten. Only in the 1980s would Greece allow most of them to return, quietly, without parades or headlines. By then, many had lost everything except their memories. The hidden cost of victory. For the West, Greece was proof that the Truman Doctrine worked. It was the first successful containment of communism. But inside Greece, that success came with a darker price. Villages, once united by hardship, became divided by suspicion. The word enemy was used freely, sometimes against one's own brother. Politics became a battlefield of memory. The trauma seeped into culture. Songs whispered about lost love and lost homes. Poets spoke of freedom in metaphors. Pain became the nation's quiet art form. The global ripple effect. What happened in Greece didn't stay in Greece. In Washington, policymakers celebrated the Greek victory as proof that military aid and intervention could stop communism anywhere. This became the model for the next 40 years. Korea, 1950s. Containment through war. Vietnam, 1960s to 70s. Aid and advisors leading to direct U.S. involvement. Latin America, 1970s to 80s. Support for anti-communist regimes, no matter their brutality. Greece was the first test case, the prototype of Cold War intervention. It showed that ideology could justify any action as long as it was framed as defending freedom. NATO and the Western Bloc. By 1952, Greece joined NATO. For the United States, this was the crown jewel of the Truman Doctrine, proof that Greece had been saved. But inside the country, many Greeks saw it differently. They felt that the war had replaced one form of domination with another, that the dream of independence had been traded for dependency. American bases dotted the landscape. Foreign advisors still influenced policy. The Cold War had secured Greece's safety, but at the cost of its sovereignty. From democracy to dictatorship. Ironically, the fear of communism, the very thing the Civil War was meant to defeat, led to one of Greece's darkest chapters. In 1967, a group of right-wing military officers seized power, declaring that they were protecting the nation from communism. This was the Greek military junta, also known as the regime of the colonels. For 7 long years, Greece lived under dictatorship again. Political opponents were jailed or exiled. Books were burned. The same rhetoric from the Civil War. Traitors, Reds, national salvation returned to justify repression. The Civil War's ghosts had come back to life, wearing new uniforms. It wasn't until 1974, after the junta collapsed, that democracy finally returned. Fragile, but determined, healing the past. The new democratic government faced a hard question. How do you heal a nation that spent decades at war with itself? In the 1980s, Prime Minister Andreas Papandreou finally recognized the Greek Civil War as a legitimate conflict, not a bandit war, but a tragedy of brothers. Political prisoners were released. Exiles were allowed to return. Monuments were built, not just for one side, but for all who suffered. It was an act of national reconciliation, long overdue. But even today, the war lingers in conversations, in the way people remember their grandparents, in the silence between generations. Lessons for the world. The Greek Civil War offers lessons that reach far beyond its borders. First, that foreign powers can never fully control the human cost of the wars they fund. Second, that ideological purity, left or right, can turn neighbors into enemies faster than any invader. And third, that victory without unity is no victory at all. Every superpower that fought proxy wars in the Cold War repeated the same mistakes, forgetting that behind every flag, every doctrine, there are real people, real families, and real pain. The echo of history. Today, when we look at modern conflicts in Eastern Europe, the Middle East, or Africa, we see echoes of Greece in 1949. Outside powers are choosing sides. Local grievances turned into ideological wars. And ordinary people pay the price for someone else's strategy. History doesn't repeat itself perfectly, but it rhymes in tragic verses. A circle completed, from the cradle of democracy to the front line of the Cold War. Greece's journey reminds us how fragile freedom really is. The same mountains that once echoed with the speeches of philosophers later echoed with the thunder of artillery. The same land that gave birth to the idea of democracy nearly lost it to division. But Greece endured. It rose again, scarred but standing. And perhaps that's its greatest victory of all. Final reflection. The Greek Civil War was not just a Greek tragedy. It was a global warning. It told the world that even in the birthplace of democracy, fear can silence freedom. That even the best intentions can ignite chaos. And that the first spark of the Cold War began not in Washington or Moscow, but in the burning villages of the Greek mountains. The Cold War would rage for decades after this. But here, in Greece, we can see where it all began. the moment when the world split in two. If you found this story moving, remember, history is never just about the past. It's a mirror for the present. So subscribe and join us in the next chapter as we trace how the Cold War spread beyond Europe, from the ruins of Greece to the jungles of Korea and the deserts of the Middle East. Because the story of the Cold War doesn't end here. It has only just begun.